a slide.
Hold on just a, hi. Welcome to another wonderful Psychology Day talk. Again, the broad topic is psychology and media. And we have another interesting talk to share with you all. This is being recorded, and we will provide information later on about how to access these recordings. Let me take just a moment and introduce. We have our presenters today. We have three presenters, Dr. Shelley Ingram, Barkley Owens, and Harold Bosstick. Dr. Ingram is an associate professor of English and folklore. Her current research focuses on folklore and crime narratives, wealth lore, and ghosts. She will be joined by two co-presenters, the first being Barkley Owens, a PhD student in folklore whose current project focuses on how women use folklore to combat the unspeakable parts of motherhood. The second is Harold Bosstick, a PhD student in folklore and literature, whose work centers on issues of folk horror, legends, and the Gothic. So if that doesn't make you interested in this talk, I don't know what will. So I am going to turn this over to our speakers. You honor us by being here, and you have sharing capabilities. Please take it away.
Thank you for having us. I'm so excited about, very excited about this talk today. Give me a second to find my screen, and of course I can't find it. Okay, one more time. There we go. And move this. Okay, so what we're going to do first is that I'm going to talk just a little bit about what folklore is, because I know a lot of people have their ideas about what folklore is, and those ideas are probably mostly right. But what you'll be surprised to find, I hope, today is that folklore is also a lot of other things. So in addition to the fairy tales and the urban legends that you may know, folklore encompasses a lot of, we do folklore every day, all the time. So I'm going to start first by just giving you a very brief kind of overview of what is folklore and how we define it, and some of the functions of folklore. So some of the reasons why we continue to make and engage folklore every day. And then I'm going to turn it over to Barkley and Harold, who will talk about their own research. And I think you're in for a big treat there. And then I'll bring it back to kind of make connections between the two, and to the larger kind of field of folklore studies, and particularly the growing focus on media and social media and the internet as a space of folklore creation. Sound good? All right, so what is folklore? So the definition, when I teach my introduction to folklore classes, I usually start with what is a folk group, because that seems to be the easiest way to kind of enter into what is folklore. So what is a folk group? And a folk group is pretty simple. A folk group is a group of people who have at least one thing in common, as long as that thing that they have in common is meaningful. So an example that I give often is that, you know, if I'm in Baton Rouge on a Friday during the school year, and I'm wearing a red shirt and someone else is wearing a red shirt, we have a thing in common, right? We have a red shirt in common, but that's really not very meaningful, that one thing. But if you're in Lafayette and it's Friday during the school year and you're wearing a red shirt, that actually is a meaningful marker of your identity, right? Because it probably means that you're doing Wear Red for Friday, which is, you know, this kind of marker that you're a UL student and you're part of the UL community. So a folk group can be a group of people who have a thing in common if that thing produces meaning. So what are different kinds of folk groups? So you have so many, and you are part of many folk groups at a time, and you move in and out of your folk groups as you kind of move through life. So, right now, some of my folk groups that I'm part of, UL community, I am a professor, I am a folklorist, I have a family, I have a friend group, I'm a University of Missouri alum who is pulling her hair out that KU won the national championship last night in basketball because we hate KU. And these are just some of the groups that I belong to. I used to work retail. So when I worked in a shoe store, I was definitely part of a folk group there because we were a group of people who had things in common that we produced, that we learned by being part of a group. So the next part, so we say, okay, I can think about a lot of different folk groups I'm in. I'm a musician, I'm a fan. So I'm, if you're a fan of a TV show and you participate in fandom, you're part of a folk group. I have a class right now that I'm teaching, which is a English class, a graduate course, and we've gotten to be pretty close to as a class this semester. And we have our own in jokes. We have our own, we have our own language for talking about things. We've developed them, and so that's part of my folk group right now. Okay, so now that we have an idea about what a folk group is, what is folklore? So folklore are the things that we do, make, say, and know that we learn from being part of that group. So things we do like traditions and rituals, how we celebrate holidays, how we prepare for the first day of something. If you play baseball, what are the rituals that you do? Do you do rally caps? Do you have a certain chant? Do you have a certain cheer? What are the superstitions that you share by being part of this folk group? Things we say, and things that we say is kind of that's like the big one. So things that we say, proverbs, stories, songs, riddles and jokes and legends and myths, right? This kind of verbal art that we engage in every day, whether or not we're telling an urban legend or telling a joke or using a proverb to make sense of something that happened. Things we make. So we learn how to do crafts from people in our folk group. We learn how to make gumbo from people in our folk group. We learn how to make, what else? Any, Barkley or Harold, do you have any suggestions? What else do we learn to make by being part of a folk group?
Learn how to make certain kinds of jokes.
Ooh,
or not make jokes.
Interesting, yeah. So you learn how to make these different things from your group. And finally, things that we know. And this is maybe the most difficult for us to kind of deal with. A lot of times when we say the things that we know, what we're really talking about is a folk belief. And folk belief is pretty difficult to contend with because and this is what I always say in class, we don't actually have access to that belief. So it's hard to know what a person really believes, right? All we have access to are expressions of that belief. So what do we mean by an expression of belief? It could be something as simple as saying, I believe that you shouldn't take a shower during a thunderstorm, or I believe that washing your hands kills germs, right? We can say those things, and that's what we look at, even if we don't have access to what a person actually believes, okay? So things that we know, we learn from being part of this group, like, do we believe in ghosts? Like, do we believe in, I believe I saw a ghost is a statement of a folk belief, but it's also a statement of something that a person knows. All right, so let's kind of move on. To another really important part of what folklore is. Folklore is stuff we learn mostly informally and mostly outside of like official conduits of knowledge like universities or government agencies. Corporations are like main headquarters. So one folklorist has called folklore fugitive knowledge, that it's something that we learn and that we know that we don't have to get permission from people in power to know or learn. Or if we do have to get permission, we find ways around that permission. One good example is the children's, if you know the children's rhyme, Miss Susie had a steamboat. Do you know that one? It goes, Miss Susie had a steamboat, the steamboat had a bell, Miss Susie went to heaven, the steamboat went to hello operator, give me number 9. If you disconnect me, I'll kick you from behind the refrigerator. There was a piece of glass, Miss Susie sat upon it and cut her big fat ask me no more questions, I'll tell you more, no more lies, right? So this is a thing that kids say. This is a children's game that they, clapping game that they'll say. And, they're not actually officially saying any bad words. So they can't get in trouble because they're not saying any bad words. And yet they're saying bad words. So folklore lets us kind of get around some of those rules and regulations that we have in place. And it's a thing that helps us think about things that are hard to express outside of our groups, things like fears and anxieties. And it's a tool for resistance, which means that there is a lot of folklore on the internet. Now, you might be thinking that doesn't sound like what I thought of folklore at all. And that's true, right? So let's think about what folklore is not for a second. Folklore does not mean untrue. So I know that folklore means something to people outside of like the discipline of folklore, and that's fine. You can continue using folklore that way when you're not in a folklore class, right? But for us, for folklorists, folklore does not mean untrue. So there's nowhere in the definition do the words like true or verified or real show up. So folklore can be true or false or in between. What we care about most is how people learn it, how people share it, and how it makes meaning in people's lives. So a folklorist's job is never to decide whether or not something is true. Like, that's just not what we do. We're not interested in that question. I know other people are interested in that question, but we're not. Folklore is also not always old. Folklore can be old, sure, but it can also be brand new. So we call that emergent folklore. As new groups form and technology in the world changes, folklore changes too. New traditions are created and old ones disappear every day. And finally, folklore is not always quaint. It certainly can be cute and quaint and funny, but it doesn't have to be. Folklore can express things that are horrible. It can express things that are not pretty. It can express things that are ugly. It can express vulgarities and bigotry and fears, etc. Okay, so I want to talk just briefly about folklore and horror. As you're kind of you'll start to see what we mean by this when I finally shut up and move on, let Barkley and Harold talk. Because folklore helps us explain and understand horrific events. There's a real clear connection between folklore and horror. It can express, like I said, fears and anxieties about our world, our bodies, and things that are different from us. We see that a lot, there's a lot of folklore of the other, folklore about things and people that are different from us. But folklore can also provide paths for healing and communal care and for dealing with the unknown. And they can help us talk about things we'd otherwise not be allowed to talk about. Because remember, folklore is that which exists outside of official rules and official documents. It's the things that you learn in college that you didn't necessarily learn in the classroom. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to these two wonderful scholars and for them to talk about how their research interests intersect at this nexus of gender and media and horror. So Barkley?
Sure. And Dr. Ingram, do you just want to keep sharing the screen and I'll just let you know when to switch?
Yeah.
I just have 2 slides. Okay, so hello everyone. I'm going to pick up right where Dr. Ingram left off. Because I am super fascinated with just like the horrors of womanhood, and the way that social or institutional knowledge like doesn't reach us a lot of the times, or doesn't validate us a lot of the times, and how women kind of fill in those gaps. So what I've been specifically reading about and researching lately is specifically about childbirth and motherhood, and thinking about if we're thinking about like how folk knowledge and folk belief is formed in the gaps where we don't have a lot of institutional knowledge, thinking about the lack of widespread knowledge about women's bodies. And obviously that institutional knowledge is most of the time out there in doctors' offices, but a lot of times it's not super accessible to people, either because of the cost of healthcare, because their doctors don't fill them in on things, or because we kind of treat the male body as the main prototype of a human body, and women's bodies are this abnormal like deviation from the normal. And so a lot of times as girls grow into women, like they aren't really given a lot of that institutional knowledge about what to expect and what's normal in ways that their bodies behave. And if there are any people listening to this right now who have had a period in their life, they probably have memories when they were approaching the age at which they would start a menstrual cycle, where stories would kind of flood between friend groups of like what to expect, horror stories of it, how to like protect yourself against embarrassing situations, strategies for how to manage that in school. Like you can probably resonate with some of the ways that those folk beliefs and that folk knowledge was shared even secretly. And there were ways that like, you know, adolescent girls were surviving in their climate in a school that really wasn't all that like conducive or supportive to dealing with such a big bodily change. And a lot of those little pieces of information were not given from a doctor, if any of it was from other menstruating people. And so thinking specifically about womanhood and motherhood, my question as a researcher is, how are women filling in those informational gaps about childbirth and early motherhood specifically, as they get to that age? Because pregnancy and childbirth is even more full of some of those scary, horrific bodily changes that are often just not talked about. And this is something that women have been filling in the gaps on for as long as people have been around. This is not new to now. There were, you know, fairy tales that allude to things. There are legends that allude to things. And people have always been sitting on porches telling stories. But that's just not happening quite as much in the way that we think of, you know, old tales. It still definitely happens, but we don't see that happening in our daily lives as much. But where we see it happening a lot is on the internet. That's where people are really going to congregate to discuss things happening with their bodies. And so I have in this little third bullet point here, I have the little abbreviation PENS, which stands for personal experience narratives. And just like riddles, jokes, legends, fairy tales, personal experience narratives are a genre of folklore in which people share like personal experiences. And so when I'm looking at this genre of folklore in terms of like women telling personal experience narratives, I'm looking at like the context. When and where are they telling these stories? When is it fitting? When do they take the opportunity to tell these stories to each other? What kind of content is in these stories? What are the horrors that they're sharing or asking about in these stories? how are they telling them? Like what's the pattern of these stories? Do they have a beginning, middle, and an end? Do they go into like graphic detail? Do they turn stories about their bodily horrors into humorous incidents, even if they were actually traumatic at the time? And then of course, like, how is the audience engaging with this? Whoever that audience might be, usually women, but not always. How is the audience responding? What do they see as their appropriate response? And then kind of this, and this isn't an exhaustive list, but these are a lot of the main things we look at. And one of the big things I like to look at is how is this functioning in the lives of women? Like that previous slide that was talking about like how it can help heal or build community. Is that happening for these women who often feel like crazy things are happening to their body and they have nobody to talk to about it and they don't even understand what's happening? Is the sharing of these stories helping them heal from that, helping them feel less alone, helping them rebel against society's standards about what they can and can't say, or helping them heal the image of like who they really are versus like the proper woman that society expects them to be? What kind of release do they feel from speaking about these unspeakable, like horrific topics that are often pretty normal events in women's lives? Yeah, so that's kind of like the general idea of what I'm really interested in. And then the next slide has an example of kind of what this looks like. So in kind of becoming interested in this, I stumbled across this very BuzzFeed-ish YouTube channel, and I don't even really understand what the purpose of this. It's a very like official channel. Like I'm sure they make lots of content. So it wasn't just posted by random women, but they kind of recruited a bunch of these women to tell their birth horror stories. And they just sat them in a chair and recorded them. And these women shared like the insane things that happened to them during birth or after birth. And so you can kind of see a screen grab from this woman named Krista, who shares that before she gave birth, her unborn child pooped inside of her, which sounds absolutely horrific, but she's not the only person that this has ever happened to. And so she shares her story of like what happened in the hospital when this occurred, how the doctors handled it, what that experience was like for her, and what she learned about her own body through that experience. And she's very humorous with this story. And so it's really fascinating the way that this is existing on the internet, not because this woman sat on a front porch and just happened to have a camera in front of her, like the olden days when people would just tell stories about their lives and people from the community would sit around and listen. But there's some company out there that actually realized like, oh, this is something that would get us a lot of likes and a lot of clicks and therefore a lot of money. And so it's kind of like a corporation taking advantage of like our folkloric tendencies as people, but that doesn't stop the folk from showing up, even though it has become kind of commodified by a corporation. And so she and a bunch of other women like tell stories throughout these videos about the insane things that happen to them. And this isn't even the craziest one. I kind of kept it a little tame on this video, but you'll notice that I've taken some screenshots of comments that are on this video, and you can see the audience interacting with Krista and with the other storytellers in the videos. So you can kind of see the function that it's serving in these people's lives, even if they're joking. So this first one at the top says, this should be titled How to Scare You Out of Having Children. So like in some ways, this can serve as a warning to women now that we have a little bit more agency on whether or not we even want to have kids. Now that that's become a little less of a social pressure in the past few decades, like women take these stories as warnings of like giving them full knowledge of like, do I even want to get into this? Do I even want to go through this? And so they can serve as pretty powerful warnings about like, what is a part of this if you choose to have this unique experience. And you can see other comments one beneath that, like quoting the story and responding, thank you for the heads up. Like they see this as important information that they wouldn't have gotten anywhere else. And then the third one the person is just reacting at like a line that they really laughed at from one of the stories, but then says, side note, I really appreciate these videos. They're very blunt and educational. Personal stories are always nice to learn from rather than random textbook words / reading materials. So this person is literally like, like a folklorist is just like, they're eating out of the palm of our hand, like we would love to hear them explicitly say things like that. Like, oh, this is better than the institutionalized knowledge that I typically get. They're basically expressing that these folk stories mean more to them than the like bland information that they're often given about women's bodies. And then I put this fourth one kind of in bigger resolution here, because it's another woman responding with her own horror story. And this is not uncommon in these kinds of situations where if you scroll down to the comments, a lot of it's going to just be people laughing or people reacting in short form. But other women feel like, oh, I'm not alone. And then they share their story. And you can see that it goes on beyond this. Like you would have to click to read more, but it empowers her to then kind of respond back. And that's another part about personal experience narratives, is that the audience often takes turns being the speaker versus the audience, where once one person shares, then another person shares. And it becomes kind of a go down the line where everybody practices in the personal experience narratives together, and they heal or feel less alone or enjoy rebelling against what society tells them they can or can't say, can or can't share together. So even with these strangers on the internet, they start to feel like a bonded connection as a woman folk group or as a childbearing folk group. And so that's what I'm really interested in, but I'm going to pass it to Harold and they'll take us home.
All right, so in particular, my studies focus a lot on legendary, and one of those aspects is monster studies. And what really fascinates me about this aspect of folklore is just that monsters are everywhere. We see them in fairy tales, local legends, oral histories, even in commercials. You look on that left-hand side here, we have Messing with Sasquatch, which is a jerky brand, a jerky commercial. We have Jaws, we have Beauty and the Beast, we have Mothman. The two girls were involved in the Slender Man slayings. But the biggest aspect of what makes monsters interesting in this aspect is that they serve as kind of a caveat and a scapegoat for social anxieties. So whatever is being felt by individuals or communities in these folk groups, these monsters tend to express either things like what they're afraid of or what they really want to experience but are not allowed to by society. And as an example, I want to look at werewolves, in particular, the 2000 movie Ginger Snaps, because it fits so well with what Barkley was talking about in terms of beginning menstruation and budding sexuality, because in a lot of ways, werewolves represent our fears of loss of control, disease transmission, natural changes to our bodies that are horrifying, and even how we have our ideas of identity. So taking this movie as an example, for those who haven't seen this one, basically the filmmakers set up the narrative so that the transmission of lycanthropy, the werewolf element, is tied in with the main character Ginger's first period and her explorations of sexuality. So in a lot of ways, that werewolf nature becomes her transforming from pre-menstruation to post-menstruation, to exploring her sexuality, even kind of getting into a point where she has sex with another man and ends up transmitting the werewolf disease to him. So we see these elements of STDs and the changes literally brought on by turning into this werewolf creature, becoming a physical manifestation of the changes that accompany with puberty. So this is all tying into how monsters can express the things we fear about ourselves, our bodies, everything around us. And by looking at how folk groups use these monsters and treat these monsters in the narratives they produce, tells us something about that folk group itself. So thinking about these women who are fearing this transformation tells us a lot about how young women who are going through that menstruation, the beginnings of menstruation, have a lot of fear about what's happening to their bodies. And a lot of that, like Barkley has mentioned, is tied into just the lack of information about how that process unravels. So these anxieties then get put onto that werewolf creature as a way to safely express those fears while also talking about some of the very real world situations. My body's changing. I'm getting hair in places I never had it before. I'm having uncontrolled rage. I'm having hormone displacements and fluctuations. And I'm fearing transmissal either of an STD or of a pregnancy. So all of these various aspects are how monsters tie into how we can look at these folks. And I think that's where I'm going to go ahead and wrap my talk up so that Shelley can kind of come back in and wrap things up for us so we can get to questions.
I was just making some notes. Sorry. So thank you so much, Barkley and Harold, for talking a little bit about your research interests. And I have some questions that I think might kind of connect these things together. But first I'll say that folklorists, we see, you know, the media has been at play in folklore studies for as long as there's, you know, been quote unquote media, that you find urban legends shared in newspapers that we know now are urban legends, but they are shared anyway. I remember when I was young reading like a letter to, it was like Ask Marilyn or something, and it was, you know, I heard of a friend who, and then they proceeded to tell the story, and I won't tell it here because it's truly awful, it's truly horrendous, but a woman who managed to kill all 3 of her children at one time, in different situations. Like one event led to the death of 3 different children, and the response was like, I've done a lot of digging and I can't seem to find that as a newspaper story. I know you said it was in the newspaper, but I can't find that anywhere. And she said, so it didn't happen, you can rest easy. And I remember thinking, well, there's no resting easy after hearing that story, no matter if it were true or not, right? So thinking about fact checking in that way doesn't, just by saying that didn't actually happen, doesn't mean that it didn't actually happen. And by that, I mean, doesn't mean that those fears and anxieties about being a mother with no help, because that's what that story was about in a lot of ways. And it involved castration too. Like, it's a truly horrific story. Doesn't mean that story isn't expressing very, very real fears and events in a person's life. But so I wanted to ask Barkley first, do you think that the medium of the comments and the personal experience narratives, because a lot of times we think of pens as, you know, you sit down and you tell somebody a story. But do you think that the medium here makes a difference in how people who are pregnant kind of talk about their pregnancies?
It's a really interesting question. I think that a lot of women have groups of friends where they would share these stories. Mm-hmm. Some don't, though. Like some operate in, you know, echelons of society where, like, discussing like the nasty bodily issues that you do not talk about. Maybe you just haven't been able to make friends, and I feel like this doesn't even need to be said, but we just live in this increasingly isolating society, especially mothers who are, 70% of women are in the workforce now, whether they have children or not. And so those opportunities where they could just be at the playground, like watching their kids from a distance, but chatting, or, like spending time together in more casual scenarios like that doesn't happen as organically now as it has in the past. And so a lot of times women forming bonds close enough where they feel like they can discuss truly nasty things that have happened to their bodies or truly traumatic experiences, those types of situations just occur less and less. But being able to talk to a camera or be anonymized behind a YouTube username, like, gives people the freedom to kind of say more than they might say in some of those more immediate social situations. Yeah, if that answers your question. I definitely think it changes things.
And I do wonder too, if the ability, right, obviously the ability to be anonymous, I mean, my sister once said something to me that she was terrified of saying out loud. And she didn't have either a folk group or, because she's not very online. So she didn't have an online community either to talk about this horrible thought that she had. And she felt like she had to talk about it. And it was about her son, how she, something that happened with her son. And yeah, so thinking about how the medium shapes the message, it is clearly something that we should all be thinking about. But that leads me to my question for Harold, and then we'll open it up to everyone because I want to hear other people talk for sure. So Harold, do you think of like this folklore, this folklore of supernatural creatures? I'm thinking about it as this kind of whisper media. So do you see that this has kind of created this alternate, because we wouldn't see these stories necessarily reported in traditional media, right? So do you think this folklore of these monsters and supernatural creatures, do you think that there has become this kind of alternate media to discuss these for some people, very real experiences?
I kind of see both angles here because, like, I've worked at a newspaper before. I know we had a story come through where people thought they saw a cougar that was shared from another news site that ended up being from a different part of Indiana entirely, not local. So, I mean, these kinds of stories I think are reported by traditional media, simply maybe more in like the kitschy, like, hey, check out this weird thing that's happened. So I think in some cases they do report on them, but not nearly with the same level of like belief and kind of, I'm losing my word here, but acceptance as you might see in things like those cryptid documentaries or ghost hunter shows, or even on social media. I'm a member of a group that talks about supernatural stuff that's happened in Appalachia. So like these types of elements, I think, are more openly talked about in those areas where the person reporting on the situation, whether that be the documentary or the other Facebook group friends, are more willing to accept the possibility, who have that better understanding of something that Bill Ellis calls belief language, about, hey, these are the things that are used to talk about these things and make them sound real. So those groups, those Facebook groups, those documentaries have more access to that belief language than necessarily like a newspaper might. But even in those types of situations, that's where we get a lot of like early reports coming in from like the Sasquatch and Bigfoot things, where some newspaper reported on it back in the 1800s and the early 1900s. Same thing with like the Jersey Devil or various other aspects, even ghosts. So I think there's kind of a two-part element going on there.
That's a really interesting point, that these folkloric spaces have more access to belief language. So they have more access to the things that believers believe than say maybe traditional media does. And therefore have a better sense of how to tell that story in a way that both makes it more believable and respects the people's beliefs themselves. So yeah.
It's definitely the biggest part there. Trust me, from what I've seen of like any modern media that reports on these things from traditional sources, It's usually like, hey, this is weird, check this out. Much
Yeah.
more voyeuristic than necessarily trying to understand someone's personal experience.
Awesome. Thank y'all so much for talking for me today. I've loved to hear both Barkley and Harold, and I'd love to hear what other people have to say.
We had a question early on in the chat, and thank you so much, by the way. Yay! This is me clapping. I don't Zoom protocol. I'm not sure what's perfect, but wonderful, fascinating topic as far as I'm concerned. And you guys did a great job. We had a chat question fairly early on from Anna Moore. I don't know if this is completely, if the context needs to be clarified or not, but she said, would SCPs be another example of this kind of folklore?
What's an SCP?
Yeah, that's what I need help with. And if you were there, you can go ahead and either unmute.
Yeah.
Either way.
Oh, okay.
I don't think Anna's here right now, so we'll have to track down. Does anybody here know what an SCP is?
No, huh?
Okay.
Now I'm imagining all kinds of things that it could be.
We could come up with some sort of mythology or folklore about what.
Absolutely. It's one of those secret things that come, you know what I mean, an SCP, and we're like, oh yeah, sure, I know. Oh, okay. Oh, like the what's the arcade?
It's like Secret Experiments 101 is this weird thing. Like if I can jump in on this one.
Sure, absolutely.
Like, I definitely feel like those are, I think there is an element of folklore to those. They are very much built into that creepypasta tradition. That's where we get things like Slender Man coming into things. Kind of like what Shelley talked about, some things are, some things aren't folklore. When it comes to that SCP stuff and those like creepypasta stories, a lot of it has to deal with how much people interact with them and how much of a life they take on outside of just that initial publication. But for a lot of those, because they are so popular, do tend to fall into that folklore category. Very much in that tradition of like Slender Man. A few years ago, we had that Momo scare going around with the creepy bird woman thing. So those type of elements are definitely tied into that very digital element of folklore and how that starts creating that imminent folklore that Shelley talked about.
Yeah, and there's, a whole genre of conspiracy theory, which folklorists haven't addressed too much in the past. I think because we felt it was subsumed under what we call legend. So for folklorists, a legend is a story that is told as true, but people have to decide whether or not you have to negotiate whether or not it's true. It's not just something that everyone would, it's raining outside, right? You're like, okay, a reasonable person, well, it's not raining outside. So a reasonable person would not argue that that it's not raining outside, right? But if you have to say, I don't know, or I don't know if you'll believe this or not, then that's what we call a legend. And legends are generally take place in our current time or in the recent past. They're not necessarily about like gods and deities, because that's the realm of myth, right? That legends are mostly about everyday people in one way or another. And they're stories that are told as true, but the speaker and the audience has to kind of negotiate whether or not they believe. So they have to decide whether or not they believe in the story. Like a ghost story is a legend because not everyone believes in ghosts. So you see a lot of these stories start with like, I don't know if this is true, or I swear that this is true, or you have to believe me when I say, because we know there's going to be this kind of negotiation of beliefs. So legend scholars treated conspiracy theories kind of in the same way. But in the last 10 to 15 years, and especially in the last 5 years, folklorists have started to think about conspiracy theories as their own category, as a category that is differentiated from like urban legend. And because it has so much to do with kind of unassailable, what seems like unassailable, wholly oppressive systems. So when you start talking about secret government experiments, right, that's, the government is seen as this kind of completely unassailable entity that you just have very little chance of fighting back against. And so conspiracy theories kind of live in that kind of sweet spot of the individual fighting against these large systems of these large systems of power. So when you have conspiracy theories or rumors about these scientific experiments, right? Science itself is a large unassailable power that we feel sometimes that we can't argue against. So in that space, kind of folklore thrives.
Oh, and just to jump off of that, Dr. Ingram, because Hannah is putting in the chat that people have begun online with like conspiracy theories and things like that. They've begun creating images and videos to prove them to be true, and how good people have gotten at that. That is going back to how the medium like impacts the message so much and how media impacts that. That's just so relevant, because in the past, if there was a conspiracy theory, before we became such creators and publishers on the internet, someone might share a story with you about what really happened on 9/11 or something like that, or these, science experiments that the government is performing. And then you might share it with someone else and add like another piece of that you heard. So you might change it and adapt it and add to it as you tell the next person. But having the creative possibilities of the internet just changes the way you can add to and adapt those stories with each new teller, by photoshopping and things like that. And I'm sure that many of you who are interested in this sort of thing know that like the Slender Man legends really like had some horrible consequences for that, because it became so believable to certain teenagers that they were actually, committing pretty insane acts of violence in the name of Slender Man because they thought it was so real. The people who had made those images and videos to prove it had done such a good job at making it believable that it was impacting people's lives in extremely real ways, which is something that folklorists love to, don't love to bring up. But whenever we think of folklore as something that's dying, it's like some of these legends are more real to people now than they've ever been in human history because of the capabilities of the internet, which is, and I think in some ways with government stuff like that, it's a way to like fight back against whatever knowledge they give us. If you don't trust them or you don't feel like you can fight back against them, making those real and believable images or videos is a way to like push back at this force of power.
Though I will say that the satanic panic of the 1980s had much of the same effect, right? People went to jail for things that they did not do. But again, media was deeply intertwined in that thing that happened. Media was reporting these things as true, as if they were really Satanists practicing Satanists who were harming people. And so I like there is this, it requires both a legend that is believable, plus the kind of medium that validates the story, or that gives it a stamp of veracity. So whether or not that's a newspaper report or, you know, a video that has hit all of the, you know, checked all the boxes to make this believable, like those two things have to work in connection in order for the legend or the conspiracy to have this kind of larger than local impact. And I think that's what I'll say.
And like, just even thinking about how some of those things translate to now, media helps kind of revive some of those elements. I mean, we've seen elements of thinking about the Satanic Panic whenever the Harry Potter series was first coming out. That was a big element of pushback from conservatives and religious folks against that series. You see it still pop up in some urban legends and folklore from smaller communities. Like, there is a cult that gathers around here at dark to do stuff. And like, even some of those ghost hunter shows and those things still make reference to, like, oh, it's the ghost of a witch that's involved here, or hey, there's still a cult in this little town that's dealing in some of those very same things that Satanic Panic elements were decrying, like exploitation of children and ritual sacrifice. So those things are still perpetuated by media today.
I wanted to step in. For one thing, I definitely can see potential connections to the discipline of psychology and the way that psychology looks at different types of things from a behavioral standpoint, from a social standpoint, and, you know, lots of sort of unmined directions, you know, that could interface with this topic. We are getting a little shorter on time, so I just wanted to offer one last opportunity for anyone who wanted to comment either out loud or through chat about this conversation. And to our speakers, is there any last, you know, thank you so much for what you've brought to the table. Any last comments or things that that you wanted to share before we wrapped up our recording today?
Thank you for letting us nerd out about folklore stuff. One of the things you'll find if you take a folklore class is that we're really nerdy about this kind of folklore stuff. So thank you for giving us the opportunity to kind of talk about it with people who aren't tired of hearing us talk about folklore. So I appreciate that.
Yeah. I'm very interested in how these things, traditions and stories, evolve and change over time as a response to culture and as a response.
Yes,
to fear. And
absolutely.
Even like the Disneyfication of some folklores is really transformed the meaning of some of those tales as it got packaged for a particular purpose. 100%,
right? Fairy tales weren't originally for kids. Fairy tales were for adults. Right. And the Disneyfication of it certainly has shifted that function of the tales over time, for sure.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up our talk for today. Again, you all, I am working with Whitney Story in our department to turn these recordings. She is going to help create a YouTube access to all of the Psychology Day and I think Psychology Week recordings. And so stay tuned as I am helped to figure out how to share all of these recordings with you all. Thank you for being here. Those of you who are watching on recording, I hope that you enjoyed it. And we hope to see you guys again down the road.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Very fascinating.
Thanks.